Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. So Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast, and we have a repeat guest with us. As you can see, it's kind of a theme lately. We're bringing back great guests to be back in Professor Game. But Matt, before we kick off with this second interview, are you prepared to engage?
I am prepared to engage, and I am an actual professor.
Yes, indeed, because Matthew Farber, Ed.D, is an assistant professor of technology, innovation, and pedagogy at the University of Northern Colorado, where he founded the Gaming SEL Lab. He has been invited to the White House, authored several books and papers, and frequently collaborates with UNESCO MGIEP and Games for Change. And his latest book, Gaming SEL, Games as Transformational to Social and Emotional Learning, is already out there. And we are going to be discussing a few things around that. But is there anything you want to say before we start?
I would like to say thank you so much for having me back on.
You're very welcome to be here. I mean, this is not just my house, it's the Engager's house, and definitely the guest's house as well. You're always welcome back, especially great guests like yourself, Matt. I have to say that.
Thank you.
So, Matt, your latest book, Gaming SEL, so Social and Emotional Learning. What is it all about? Like, I've heard this. I've been hearing social and emotional learning very much lately. What is it all about to begin with?
That's a great question to kick things off. And social emotional learning is a set of, this is not like a quotable definition, but essentially it's a set of inter and intrapersonal skills, which can range from teamwork and collaboration, empathy, perspective taking, responsible decision making, and so forth. It has quite a long history, which I do track in the book somewhat. You could write a whole separate book on the history of social emotional learning, but it certainly has come into the lexicon as the COVID-19 pandemic scaled in 2020. I mean, the former Vice President Mike Pence here in the U.S., I remember seeing him at a lectern on TV talking about children's social and emotional learning during remote instruction. And I'm not getting political whatsoever, but just to hear that on TV, it's sort of like my parents knew what Google Classroom was by virtue of it being on the news all the time. And it's like, oh, so that's what you do for a living. I get it, right? So the literal phrase, social and emotional learning, goes back to a conference in 1994 where researchers and academics met. And what came out of that was the phrase, but also CASEL, which is now known as the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning. The A stood for, forgot, but something else at that time, not academic. They didn't quite link it to academic learning just yet. And it's been around for quite a while. And I in my book, I spoke to one of the board members of CASEL. There are about 30 million children in the United States and in North America more generally, actually, have been involved in their framework and how they define SEL. There are over 117 different frameworks and different definitions.
Oh my goodness.
Different competencies. Some have mindfulness, some have character education. The way CASEL describes it is that it's different than character education, which could be things like honesty and integrity, which might be part of a school's culture. But that's not quite the same as SEL. They put it with emotional intelligence, or EQ. It really stems from Goleman's book in the 1990s about emotional intelligence, and that being the starting point for developing as an emotional person. And as it happens in the last several years, maybe not even that many years, the cognitive neuroscience through fMRI studies have been showing that SEL is in fact teachable. That most of us are born, almost all of us are born empathic, right? We feel how others feel. We think how others may think. But those are teachable skills. While they may be inherent, they can be fine-tuned. And there is science. Initially, it's been around like since the 1990s, but why now, right? So maybe it is college pressure and career pressure, 20th century pressure, 2020. But I mean, historically, there's always been something, right? So I find it interesting. And we can again, I could talk for the entire podcast about the history of this. So we could circle back.
It seems like there's everything all about social emotional learning. It's not by chance that you're writing this book. I'm sure you have quite a bit of a backlog on things that you researched and you went through to go for this book, which is not just on social emotional learning, I have to say.
That's true. And, it's interesting. When I was starting to research this sort of thing, originally I was teaching in the middle school classroom, and I was using games to teach content. But at the time, there was a lot of talk about how games can teach, and there still is, research on 21st century skills, what they called, even though we're 21 years into the 21st century, and the framework for 21st century skills isn't even on the website that used to host it. It's buried on something called Battelle for Kids. And these are sometimes called soft skills, and they're sometimes called career and workforce readiness skills. I think they've just been remapped a bit as social emotional learning skills. But what I was fearing was educators possibly saying, well, let's put two kids on a Chromebook and we'll call that teamwork, and that's not deep enough because games can do so much more. If you think of a cooperative game like Pandemic, right, or Forbidden Island,
both by Matt Leacock, who has very recently been on the podcast. You might want to take a look at that.
I heard that, actually. And
cool.
And he was in my book also because I spoke to him during the actual pandemic. He wrote a piece for the New York Times, how we are all in this together. And we had my son play. He was 9 at the time with myself and my wife. And when we were done, he saw why we all had to social distance and remain indoors. Because the game proceduralizes teamwork. It doesn't just say, go work on a team. And I really wanted to tease that out and bring that to educators and parents' attentions.
Makes a lot of sense. And that's a beautiful example. It's a game I've fallen in love with. So having the other Matt on the podcast was an absolute pleasure as well.
He's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads me to one of the main questions I always like to do. And you've kind of been going around it. It's part of the reason why you were saying, probably because it's all about social emotional learning right now. But what was missing out there and what was it that pushed you into writing this book? Because you're an author. I mean, it's not your first book. You decided to choose this over whatever else you had on your plate as well. What made you do this and how or why is it different from other books that are already out there or other pieces of research that have been done?
Well, first, there are no books like this, which I found interesting. And I mean, I don't want to say comforting because when I wrote other books on gamification and game-based learning, clearly I wasn't the only book out there. And by the way, none of us compete. I remember Greg Topo's book came out when my first book came out. And I was like, this is great. We both amplified each other's work, right? So yeah. I think of it like a large cooperative game because we want to bring play into children's learning, all of us, right? So there's that. But I found that there was some work being done on games and learning, but there weren't books on it. There are some organizations that I've consulted with and have done some work with, such as I Thrive Games, a nonprofit here in the U.S. With Paul DeVarcy, we developed curriculum around What Remains of Edith Finch. I've done youth game design with a co-PI here, having kids make games about their lived experience, and we published on that with I Thrive. Done work with UNESCO. Games for Change does this. And they both look at games and social emotional learning. But again, there was no book on it. There are some books and some materials if you just look on Amazon, but what you see are social skills, not social and emotional learning, which is different than social skills. Social skills are often designed for children who have, individualized education plans, what we call IEPs here. They may be on the autism spectrum disorder. There may be social stories. There may be situations where you have to decide what is the socially appropriate way to navigate these challenges. I've seen card decks on mindfulness, or there's a game where you hit a spinner, you spin a spinner and you go in different yoga poses, but not exactly social emotional learning. And then on the flip side, when you attend conferences on serious games and games for change and social impact games, there's a lot of talk about empathy and just not really getting to the heart of what that actually means, in my opinion. In fact, Dr. Karen Schreier and I, we have an accepted paper on games and empathy. We've also written together another paper on games and empathy for UNESCO, and we found that there are almost dozens of types of empathy. And then when you dig deeper, there are things like empathic concern. Are you demonstrating concern, right? It's not just empathy. I felt like it was almost like, here, read this book and now you have empathy, right? Or play this game because you're this avatar. Now you know what it's like to be in a civil war in Syria. And no, you don't, right? There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of nuance to it. And there's a lot of research coming out. But I wanted to house it all together in a way that makes sense. I also wanted to write about what games are as experiences, not as transactions. And I also wanted to go even further back to Fred Rogers, the children's television host, who is considered the father of social emotional learning back when educational technology meant educational television.
A while ago, right?
Yeah, in the late 1960s. He saw that lots of kids are watching TV, so we might as well do something good with this. This is the same time that Sesame Street was coming around. And Fred Rogers, he had something called the Neighborhood of Make-Believe, where through puppets and play, he would talk about topics not normally on children's television. He worked with psychologists, notably Margaret McFarland, also Eric Erickson, Brazelton, and many of the leading psychologists of the time. And Margaret McFarland read every single line of every script that he had and song. In my book, I interviewed 3 Fred Rogers Center fellows, and they shared how one of her quotes was, "Whatever is mentionable is manageable." And that gave Fred Rogers the license to talk about death, divorce, loss on a show aimed at 4 and 5-year-old children. And in a way, you could say that the Neighborhood of Make-Believe was a sort of game. And then in my book, I spoke to Jesse Schell and Sabrina Sulba, who used to work with Jesse Schell at Schell Games. And Jesse Schell develops, through Schell Games, Daniel Tiger Games and Apps. So Daniel Tiger is, I guess, the fictional son of Daniel Striped Tiger, who was the puppet that Fred Rogers controlled on the show. And Daniel Striped Tiger talked about, not fitting in with others. Is he like other tigers? Why is he different? Why is he not strong? And Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, it's a cartoon on PBS, a children's show right now, and there are apps that support it and a whole ecosystem of games. So it's really interesting to see the trajectory from children's television to current ways that social emotionally learning can be embodied through play, apps, games, and so on.
So that's what the book is focused on, like seeing what has been the trajectory and what can be done right now, or how is it structured? How's if you were to sort of, I don't want to say selling, because I know many people hate that sort of attitude of selling your book or whatever, but if you were telling somebody about the book and how it looks and is it structured, we already know what it's about. What would that look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually, I don't mind the word selling because in my courses, I go through we do a Shark Tank about ideas, and it's actually you're selling an idea when you write a book or you make a podcast or you create any form of media, make a game. You're designing something for somebody else to consume, right? So it's important that you don't put the reader to sleep. I was trying to be cognizant of where to toe the line between packing in the research and making it readable, right? So anyway, it is structured like this. The first chapter is on Fred Rogers, but also joint media engagement, which comes from children's television, and framed around something called mood management theory, that we shouldn't really think just about screens, but mood management theory. Some books, games, music, TV, film, all these forms of media that we consume, we do this because it will also entertain, but it also changes our mood. Not all movies are Marvel Cinematic Universe films with Spider-Man, right? Sometimes we need to watch more serious fare, but you can't just watch more just serious movies. I can't watch a war movie the whole time. That's going to be really depressing, right? So we balance our mood, and children do that as well when they play games. And we have to think more about why. Why does that work? And mood management theory goes back to the early 1980s, and I think that's a healthy way to think about why we connect with games. The next chapter is about the exploration of social emotional learning. And then the third chapter in this first part of the book, there's two parts, is called How Games Give Players the Feels. And it's really about the affordances and constraints of how games create emotional and meaningful experiences for players. The second part of the book is based on research, practice, and themes. So there's a chapter on empathy games. So how can games teach empathy? The neuroscience behind that, as well as the appropriateness of having role play in classrooms. What is safe to do and not to do? And I had a long conversation with a co-panelist from Games for Change from Facing History on Ourselves about, if you have a child write a journal article and then perform in a skit and then play a game, where is that appropriate or not, right? Where are you appropriating somebody else's experience? How can that be done thoughtfully? The next chapter is on mindfulness and compassion, so how games can make us pro-social. Then there is a chapter on ethics, because games are ethical systems. They impose, through their rule structure, ethics, and sometimes it's implicit and sometimes it's explicit. And then there's a chapter on co-op play, teamwork, and relationship skill building. So we have games like Matt Leacock's games on cooperative games, but also escape room games do this as well. Esports, another example. And then the last chapter is how making games supports self-awareness. So there's the research and practice on how game design itself hits on many aspects of self-awareness in SEL, like perspective taking and empathy.
Wow. So that's a very, very nice, very detailed way of seeing the book and seeing as well the interests of different people, because we've had here, different types of authors. You are of the academic type, of course, because you're an academic as well. And this book serves as well as part of your research. So this is very interesting. I wanted to know, that perspective. How has that changed? I'm not sure if any of your books, I think most of your books are focused on research. Is that right?
They are, but also practice. I mean, I have probably the most dense book was one I edited for IGI Global with a really long name called Global Perspectives on Gameful and Playful Teaching and Learning. And essentially, they read like expanded academic journal articles, and it's a very expensive book. And I don't go on podcasts promoting it, to be honest. They're mainly aimed at libraries. This book I really wrote for anybody to read. So there are citations, but it's written in a very approachable language on purpose. So my wife has a master's degree. She teaches pre-K 4 in the same school district where my university is situated. But she enjoyed editing the book for me. It's really hard for me to get her to read anything I write. And, she has to teach, and she's asked to teach social emotional learning in her classroom. And it doesn't need to be part of a course, but it could be part of a course. A teacher or parent or caregiver, or really anybody, a game designer, of course, can just read the book without any context at all. And that was very intentional. I also interviewed about 50 different people in the fields of academia, but also in game design and teachers, how they use games.
So it's basically of course, it's open for anybody without, as you were saying, without any context, but Would you say it's geared towards some audience? Because you were talking about this, and I'm thinking probably one of the most suitable audiences for this are teachers who are implementing this in their classrooms.
So this is a question it's like the form you get from your publisher. You check off the box, how you want it to be sorted out on Amazon. So there is a degree of psychology in here, media psychology as well. But I would say primarily teachers. That would be number one. It could also be read by any parent. A parent watches their child play Minecraft and Roblox during the pandemic and has concern. This is the book. It could also be used in college courses because there are discussion questions on a supporting website I have for this book. It could also be used by policymakers as well. I tried to make sure it was broad enough to be read by as many people as possible, and that was intentional. There are ideas here, and there are games to follow and games to play, but also the way, I found it interesting to write and research Chapter 2, Exploring Social Emotional Learning, exploring that there have been questions about the CASEL framework, which has been used in so many schools here. And it was interesting to me to ask the critiques to a board member of CASEL and to hear a frank response from that. And to really frame where games can fit in curriculum. Because more and more teachers are being asked to teach SEL. And where do you do that? You have to teach so much already. The curriculum is so jam-packed. How do you even get that in a semester or a year, right? And then to say, okay, on top of that, we have to have children check in with their moods and feelings and deepen empathy. And a teacher might be like, well, I'm already teaching math, or I'm already teaching English language arts or history or science. How do I fit all that in? This is just too much. So I also offer different ways to do that at all different grade levels, because social emotional learning is not just for young children. It's for really anybody, but really I focus from children through adolescence.
Makes sense. And that is absolutely great. And you were saying that it's, of course, written so that anybody can read it. But I do think that there is an argument for understanding, like having a deep understanding, which you definitely do, of your primary audience, and making sure it's very well crafted and suits that audience like super well, which I'm sure it does. And you know that audience very well. You come from that audience yourself.
I would say K-12 teachers for sure, or pre-K through 12 would be the primary audience. I would also say that people reading this book do not have to be gamers or self-label themselves as gamers. I asked this at conferences, who's a gamer? And like 2 hands go up, right? And then who has a game on their phone? Who plays Candy Crush? And a lot of hands go up. So
yeah,
it's a loaded word, right? But it is not written for gamers at all. Most people in the U.S. know Fred Rogers and the work of children's television and Sesame Street. So I found that to be a pretty good entry point. Also, I've been working on some projects on a project with Tracy Fullerton on her Walden a Game, and we're creating 30-minute modules of her game. She is, but we're creating curriculum to go around those modules that could be now streamed on a Chromebook. And I asked her lots of questions about games, because games are not a series. I want to also redefine or better define or leave my imprint of what games are. And I spoke to a lot of people in this space. Celia Hodent, who designed the user experience for Fortnite. We spoke about affordances for emotions. Like, how do games create emotions? Like, there's a game called Loneliness, right? And in that game, you're a dot. And there are other dots. Just that's it. And when you move by the other dots, they scatter. Or the little dots move by you, they scatter. So it makes you feel lonely on purpose. So it uses the mechanics of the game to create an emotion. And I think that's interesting, right? But games do more than that. That's like saying symbolism is something that's in literature or in film, but it's actually just part of literature. It's part of narrative storytelling. It's not the storytelling. And some games, particularly educational games, It might be fine to, if you're cutting objects to teach fractions, that's a nice balanced experience. But where is the emotion in that? Really good games, and so there are some games that do that where there are some emotions, right? Like Slice Fractions does that pretty well. But there are games that don't do that so well. And I find that's missing in a lot of educational games. The difference between educational and commercial games are commercial games tend to be designed around the experience of the player, just like film is, or plays and theater, or books. If you go to a play and it's all exposition and lecturing at the audience, it's going to be a pretty boring experience, right? Good games take players on an emotional experience. I think a terrific one is Alba, which takes place off an island in Spain. And it's on Apple Arcade, but it's also on different platforms. It just won an award at Games for Change. And I love the game. It's great. You play as a young girl, and there's a lot of paella. And you wander around, but you have a checklist, and you clean up the island. But you also have to consider whether or not a hotel should be built there or not built there, because it would displace the ecosystem. And you take photos of wildlife in your missions. And it does teach about natural sciences and ecosystems and environment, but it's not heavy-handed. It's telling a story first. It's an experience with emotions first. And in my book, I spoke to three different game designers that also work for Disney as Imagineers. And I think of games more like, and I want teachers to think of games less as machines and computers, that when you click the right buttons, you're dispensed knowledge, right? That's not fully true. I want teachers to think of games more like the Haunted Mansion ride at Disneyland, where you put it in the Doom Buggy, is what it's called, in the Omni Mover, and you move through the Haunted Mansion. You can't see all around you. Your field of vision is blocked by the Doom Buggy. It's like this shell. And it's in other Disney rides too, like the Little Mermaid ride, except it looks like a literal shell. And in Haunted Mansion, you're moved along a rail, and the ride will move you around. I'm physically moving while I'm explaining this. It doesn't work on a podcast. But when you're moving around, you see these large set pieces that the designers want you to see, like the Hatbox Ghost or the Hitchhiking Ghost. And you feel maybe, mortality because you're seeing ghosts, right? You feel these little scary emotions in a playful way, right? And that's what a really good game does. In fact, a lot of game designers use that very word, on rails. The game will move you around to these experiences, their design experiences, what they want you to experience and feel, and these meaningful situations. And a lot of good games are about what happens before you click the button and how you feel after you click the button. It's not just clicking the button.
Interesting. That's a completely, deep understanding of games as well. And I would say it's going beyond the typical thing, as you were saying, just seeing the games as a boat where you put people in that boat and you push them through and they'll learn, and that's it. It's you put them in the boat, and there's all things. You're going back to the Disney experience. You put them in the safari boat. I don't know if that's still around. It's back in the day when I was a kid. That you go and you see all these animals happening and all these emotions that you get, and you're surprised and you're scared and all these things. It is an experience in and of itself.
And that's what a really good game is. In fact, Galaxy's Edge, the new Star Wars land, it's interesting as well, because in Disneyland, it's what Tracy Fulton quotes Johann Huizinga. I'm not even pronouncing that correctly. But, in a game, it's where, right? So it's where games where special rules obtain. So when you enter Disneyland, it doesn't matter who you are and how old you are. Adults are expected to fly in elephants and spin around on teacups, right? It's just what happens. Much like a game will give you permission to do that. Same when you go in Galaxy's Edge, it's even more so, because you don't just see characters walk around. You're part of that Star Wars story. The stormtroopers will come up to you and pretend they're reporting on you for being in the resistance. So you're really playing part of a game, right? And I think it's better to think of games like that. So going back to Pandemic, right? When you play the game Pandemic, and I played it in a classroom, I had 11-year-olds play the game in my classroom to learn about smallpox spreading during the Columbian exchange to the Americas and how that happened and why the world needs to work together. And this is a number of years ago. And towards the end of the game, as I'm sure you played and you know, right, Matt Leacock tries to get these what he calls story beats going, right? So just when you think something's going good, something bad happens. You pull up, one of the cars and more disease cubes go on the board, right? But when you get when you get to the game where there's like 4 cards left and you're really nervous whether or not it's going to be an epidemic card you pull or not, right? The emotions before that happens, that's called situational game design. And that's from Brian Upton, who's a game designer and he's a game studies theorist. And that's what he talks about. It's called anticipatory play and active constraints. So it's not the turning over of the card. It's how you feel anticipating those emotions before you turn over the card.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Matt, we still have a little bit more of time, and I would like to make sure to get in this question from the audience before we take off and, of course, talk about where to find your book. This person is called Johan de Bruin, and he's talking about his, he has a company and they're creating games, and he's because, and I'm sure you know a little bit more about this and you might be able to help, but he says, where do educators sort of hang out to find educational tools? He says their game has little to no exposure, and even though the core of the game is free, there are in-app purchases, but they're not essential. So how do you find people who might be interested in this whole thing, or how have you been doing it? If you have any, tools of the trade in that sense.
Sure, of course. Well, I would say conferences are great. Now, it's sort of a double-edged sword these days with so many virtual conferences. So, for instance, Games for Change became free and online, and there are a lot of ideas shared there. But what you lose is playing games with others at those conferences. I would go to a conference, Connected Learning, Games for Change, Serious Play Conference, and afterwards, I think you've been to a Serious Play Conference before, but not the same one I've been at.
Yeah, right before the last one before the pandemic hit.
Right. And I remember I went with my family once, and we went to the one in University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we played tons of games after the conference. We played this card game called Guillotine. We just play lots of games, and you talk about games. And that aspect is missing from virtual, of course, right? But I think conferences are great because there's a lot of exchanging of ideas. And also, all games are art. So all art builds on the shoulders of others, right? So, remixing content and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's fully answering the question.
I do. In fact, I think it provides actually 2 answers. One of them is not necessarily what they were asking, but it's also a source of inspiration. I think conferences are great for that. And of course, a place to see other people who are interested in what you're doing, hang out, see what they're interested in as well. And as well, even if it doesn't fully answer the question, it does guide you towards the answer, which is going to conferences and finding out where these people and their peers are hanging out as well. So I do think it's a very...
My dissertation was about community of practice among a cohort of teachers that use games. And that is what I looked at. They are literally practitioners. So I am totes biased about gaming conferences, right? But I mean, honestly, if you go to another type of conference, are there going to be people playing so many games at the conference? The whole conference is around play, right? So they're one of the more fun conferences to go to.
Oh, for sure. I really enjoy that. I know there's been many efforts in the online conferences of trying to bring that experience together as well. And people who are very willing go through it as well. But then one thing that you lose with digital conferences is beyond the togetherness, which can kind of be simulated as well, is the fact that you're at home or at the office. So when you are at home or at the office, you have an extra affordance that you don't have when you have to travel to that place. And you can just log off and go back to work, right?
Yeah, that's the terrible part because, when I go to a conference, I put in the paperwork at work and fly to the conference, drive to the conference, and you're at the conference. You're fully there and aware.
And that's it. It's all the things that you're doing, and you're focusing on that. Whereas if it's not, and it's part of maybe the excuse you might say at work, like, oh yeah, but it's a virtual conference. If anything comes up, I can do this and that, which some people, to be fair as well, were going to conferences and then, sort of Skyping and doing work things, but it's sort of the exception is that. Whereas in this other situation, the exception could be the people that actually go through the whole conference and experience the whole thing. It's not the majority of people doing that. And it's something that is, as I agree with you, is kind of lost in that effort of conferences recently.
But maybe soon again.
Hopefully. With vaccines and things, well, not getting better yet that much, but, hopefully getting better with the vaccines as well. Hopefully this will start to get better before it gets worse, hopefully. All fingers crossed. So Matt, before we kick off, where can we find the book? Can you give us any more information? And of course, where can we continue to find out about what Matt Farber is doing in the world of gaming?
Yes, thank you. So my book is available at almost all online retailers, including Amazon. It is also on Kindle on Amazon, which is useful for some folks who, if it's in different markets or whichever. And of course, it's on the publisher's website as well, peterlang.com. You can search for it there. And on the publisher's website is where, if it's adopted for a course, there you can request an exam or a desk copy there and preview it. And on Amazon also, it is, I think the whole first chapter or most of the first chapter is previewable.
Nice.
And my website as well is matthewfarber.com. And I'm on Twitter at matthewfarber.
That sounds fantastic. So thank you very much for writing yet another book and putting all this value out there in the world. Thanks for being in the podcast and talking about it, giving us part of that value of the book. Of course, there's plenty more where that comes from, which is in the book and of course with Matthew. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Matthew, all you have to do is go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started into our email list for free. That way we'll be in contact. You'll be the first to know of any opportunities, the new episodes, everything that we are sharing through our email list. Everything like that will be coming directly to your email inbox. And before you click continue, before you go on to your next mission, remember to follow or subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.